Ladies and gentlemen, today we will be making a Brazil presidential tier list. So for those who don't know, a tier list is when we categorize people from best to worst, starting from the superb tier, going all the way to A, B, C, D, E, and F. Superb will be those who were really good and didn't do anything that's overly awful. Then A, people who were really good, B, kind of better than average. C, honestly, is going to be mostly guys who only stayed in power for a few days or a few months, but also those who just didn't do anything particularly noteworthy. D is people who were bad, but not horrible. E is for those who were horrible, but not game-breakingly bad. And F is for those who were so horrible they crippled the country for generations to come. Starting off on the wrong foot, we have Teodoro da Fonseca. This guy is a marshal, he's a military guy, and he's the one who installed our presidentialism. Before him, we had something of a parliamentary empire with an emperor that's pretty popular even up to this day, and in fact, Teodoro had nothing against the emperor. It's a pretty long story of why he threw the military coup that he did in order to depose the emperor. Apparently, it may have involved there may have been something of a personal issues involved. But regardless of why or how he became the president, I'm not going to put anything that doesn't count for or against him. What matters is what did he do as a president? Well, he took over on November 15 with dictatorial powers, and by December 23rd, so a month and a week later, he was already imposing censorship. He's the kind of guy who centralized power. He took the emperor's powers and then some. He was weakening the Senate, he was weakening the city governments and state governments, and just centralizing as much power as he could on himself. He wanted to favor his own personal friends with very profitable deals, giving them free land, all sorts of nice stuff, which, of course, all of his ministers opposed, which led to every single minister resigning on the same day. And he just said, that's nice, that's more of a chance for me to appoint my own friends as the ministers. And those guys led to a easy credit policy, which created a huge bubble, and a crisis called encilhamento, which is some writing analogy I do not understand. And that guy goes straight to F tier. Absolutely shit, start to end. Ugh, no, horrible. And, he was at the start of our presidency, so everything bad he did had plenty of time to fester and become much, much worse over time. In 1891, Congress tried to limit the president's power because they saw he was collecting all that power to himself. So he just said, good job, guys. How about I declare a state of emergency, or state of exception, technically, and dissolve parliament, and instead of having governors in the provinces, I'm going to appoint state interventors. Things got so bad that the Armada rebelled and threatened to bomb the shit out of Rio if he didn't renounce, so he renounced. And it's important to notice that back then, Rio was the capital, and the Armada was mostly in Rio. So if the Armada, and there was no such thing as an air force, so if the Armada said, we gonna bomb Rio, there's literally nothing anyone else could do to stop them, or at least nothing anyone in Brazil could do to stop them. After him, we get Floriano Peixoto, which is another admiral. He was actually one of those ministers that resigned when Teodoro wanted to favor his friends, which makes you think that Floriano is going to be better, and truth be told, he was better. He would have had to work really hard to be worse, but he was still a centralizing asshole. At least, he didn't try any coup d'etats, he didn't shut down the parliament, but he still hunted down and arrested any opposition that he could, until the Armada rebelled once again, and said, get the fuck out or we are gonna bomb the shit out of Rio. But he was more prepared, he knew they could do that. So he brought in the US Navy to repel them and managed to stay in power a little longer. So I'm gonna put him in E tier. He's still bad, not as horrible, but still fucking asshole really bad. That brings us to Prudente de Morais, who was the very first direct election in Brazil. Those previous two, they were indirect elections, so parliament chose the president. Prudente was the first direct president. He was from São Paulo, which is very important because he was supported by the São Paulo coffee industry, which was Brazil's main industry at the time. So he was the guy with the big money behind him. He was also the first civilian president. Those two, see all their medals or their laurels, they were military guys, they were marshals. And it's ironic that Prudente de Morais was our first civilian president because during his term, France decided to invade Amapá from the Guyana, and England decided to invade the Trindade Island, which is 1,200 kilometers off the coast of Espírito Santo, so it's off the map. And facing these two invasions, he chose the diplomatic solution. He had both cases solved through international arbitration, one through the intervention of Portugal, the other with Switzerland. He only declared state of exception once after there was an attempt on his life, and his Minister of War, because back then Minister of Defense was called Minister of War, his Minister of War died defending him, so he called the state of exception for a little while, didn't do anything too horrible during it. So I'm actually going to put this. Oh, and it's also worth noting that Barão do Rio Branco, who was Brazil's main diplomat guy throughout history, he started gaining some prominence in the Prudente de Morais government during the whole solving these invasions sort of deal. But after this guy, who was the very first São Paulo coffee candidate, we have Campos Salles. And everyone from Campos Salles to Washington Luiz is what we call the Café com Leite Republic. What is the Café com Leite Republic? It's when the two most populous states, São Paulo and Minas Gerais, decided, you know what would be cool? If the two of us got together and then we could control the result of every single presidential election and then we own the country. Then we can force everybody else to subsidize our two industries, which were coffee and milk, hence the name Coffee and Milk Republic. Of course, that wasn't very nice for the rest of the country, but these guys managed to stay in power for 32 years. So next time some American complains about the Electoral College, remind him of the one time two states literally controlled Brazil for 32 years. And I would put them all in a D tier, somewhere between a D and an E. And it's going to be a collective thing. They're all getting the same grade because they all did pretty much the same thing. And I'm inclined to put them on D, but I'm from one of the regions that most benefited from them, so I'm going to admit my bias and put them on an E instead. This next guy over here is just slightly noteworthy that he may or may not have been Brazil's first and so far only black president. And some biographies say he was black, some say he was white. Truth is, he was probably an in-between, which is very common in Brazil. And it's also very noteworthy because he took office 21 years after we abolished slavery. So kudos to Brazil. And the Café com Leite thing was doing pretty well, at least for São Paulo and Minas Gerais. Until there was this small crisis in 1929. And during this crisis, São Paulo and Minas milked the rest of Brazil extra hard with their subsidies. And that led to a lot of insatisfaction. Not only that, but São Paulo broke the deal. Because they were doing one president from São Paulo, one from Minas, then São Paulo, then Minas. Then São Paulo said, you know what, I want to run twice in a row. So Minas got together with several other states and said no. And they threw in their support with a guy from the south called Getúlio Vargas. And they still lost the election. São Paulo won. But a lot of those states just said, how about no? And they threw a coup, and they just placed this guy, Getúlio Vargas, in the presidency. He suspended the constitution, he assumed dictatorial powers, banned all political parties but his own, had black shirts beating up the opposition, arrested or exiled his opposition. He appointed interventors in states instead of allowing governors to be elected. He was a piece of shit. And he wasn't just any piece of shit, he was a fascist piece of shit. I'm going to put him as at the rock bottom. He's the kind of guy who deported Jews to Nazi Germany so they could die in extermination camps. Now, it wasn't a generalized deportation, and nobody knows for sure how many he sent, but there was a case where he sent 15 Jews in one day, and estimates vary, I would say somewhere between a few dozen and 100 or 200 Jews. Almost as importantly, he denied visa to 16,000 Jews fleeing from Nazi Germany because he associated Jews with communists and subversive ideas. So they were undesirables who needed to be persecuted internally, sometimes shipped abroad, and almost never allowed in. And because he was such a piece of shit, at one point, in 1932, São Paulo threw its own revolution, trying to overthrow him. This was a civil war that lasted about 3 months, but although most people seem to think that this was a secessionist, a separatist rebellion, which it was not. They just wanted to overthrow the fascist guy. Or some people might say they were butthurt because they lost their ability to have the rest of the country subsidize their industry, which is probably a little bit of a reason, but, they had plenty of good reasons to want to oust Getúlio. Of course, São Paulo lost that rebellion in 1932 because Getúlio Vargas stayed in power for 15 years. And because of this rebellion, he increased defense spending by 50%. He installed the very first gun-controlled law in Brazil, which was essentially you can't manufacture machine guns without a permit. Gun control at the time, haha. But on the bright side, there's one thing we have to give him credit for. He did help elections be a lot more clean. There was a lot of cheating before him. There was still a lot of cheating after him, but a lot less compared to before. And he also instituted the female vote, which is something that was happening at the time all around the world as a result of World War One. And yeah, suffragettes in England, nurses in Canada, and Getúlio instituted female voting in Brazil. A little late, but he's the one who did it. Gotta give him credit. So when this World War II started happening, he really wanted to join in with the Nazis for obvious reasons. And there's also another reason because the US and Germany were kind almost tied as Brazil's largest trading partners back then. If I remember my history class correctly, it was 24% of our trade was made with Germany and 25% with the US, but don't quote me on that. So he wanted to join Germany. A lot of his generals wanted to join Germany, and he was playing hard to get in international states, so he essentially auctioned to Brazil, and the US paid more, so we joined the US in the war. So we joined the Allies and fought in Italy. And when our troops came back from Italy, they thought, this thing about a guy who stays in power 15 years, beats the shit out of opposition, black shirts, extremism, press censorship, shutting down every single party other than his own. We saw some of that in Europe, and it didn't look very good. So maybe we shouldn't have that here either. So that led to a lot of protests, a lot of resistance, and then he was forced to abdicate in 1945, which led José Linhares to take office. And honestly, José Linhares was the president of the Supreme Court. He was in the line of succession, and he assumed, stayed for a few months, did nothing, which was exactly what his job demanded of him, so I'm afraid he's getting a C. Didn't do anything, didn't really have a chance to do anything. That brings us then to Eurico Gaspar Dutra, who was one of Getúlio's generals, one of those guys that wanted to throw in with the Nazis. He outlawed gambling in Brazil, he broke relations with the Soviet Union, he started recording GDP growth, so he was the first president that we have data about the GDP, and honestly, Brazil seems to have grown pretty well at the time, at a 7.6% average, although how reliable that data is, or whether or not it was just bouncing back from the war economy, that's up for debate. But when he got into power, Brazil had a major budgetary surplus, which he turned into a major budgetary deficit, so I can't really say he was that good or that bad. He could have been anywhere between a B and a D, so I'm throwing him smack dab in the middle. Then, you may notice how this guy looks similar to this guy, right? It's the same guy, but 10 years later. And when Getúlio assumed as president, he just started spending tons of money trying to become popular, but in a beautiful twist of fate, he got to taste the consequences of his own actions and his own mismanagement of the economy earlier, so now he gets a simple D. He wasn't that bad on second term. He was extremely unpopular because everybody got to see how much of a piece of shit he was, and there was this one case where a journalist was killed. Whether or not he killed the guy is quite frankly irrelevant. What matters is that everybody thought he killed the guy because the journalist was talking shit about him. And he killed himself because of it. He pulled a 13 Reasons Why on the country and said, "Oh, you guys are bullying me, I feel sad," and he killed himself. And somehow that worked. It got people to stop trash talking him so much, and that, plus the fact that he copied Mussolini's labor laws, makes a lot of people think he was a good guy, but no. Any tier list that doesn't put the fascist in the bottom was made by a fascist. So his vice president, Café Filho, takes over. He didn't stay for too long. He left due to health issues, but he was a decent president. He actually started undoing a lot of his spending increases. He did some tax cuts, some spending cuts. So he undid a tiny fraction of Vargas's bullshit, so yeah, he earns his spot at a B. He's followed by Carlos Luz, who was president of the Chamber of Deputies. Now, remember, president killed himself. Vice president, health conditions. So the president of the Chamber of Deputies took over. He stayed for exactly 3 days. Poor guy. And he was removed from office over concerns that he would not let the next president, the elected Juscelino Kubitschek, take office. So people were afraid that he might throw in a coup, so he only stayed there for 3 days. So, because the president killed himself, the vice president left for heart issues, and the president of the Chamber of Deputies was deposed, the president of the Senate assumed for 2 months just to oversee this transition period for Juscelino Kubitschek. So, Nereu Ramos, 2 months, again, not a lot can be said about him. And in comes Juscelino Kubitschek. Because nobody can pronounce or spell his name in Brazil, because it's an Eastern European name, Brazilians aren't very good at names with a lot more consonants than vowels, people just call him JK. And this guy, oh boy. His main accomplishment was building the city of Brasilia and switching the capital. This city here, in the middle of the country, in the middle of nowhere. As I said earlier, the capital was previously Rio. And there are good arguments for the construction of Brasilia. In fact, transferring the capital from Rio to Brasilia is a very old idea. Even back in our empire days, there was this case where the British parked their ships in Rio and held the city hostage. And people started thinking, okay, we should have a capital that is not easily bombardable from the shorelines. So they switched it from Rio to Brasilia. Or, sorry, they wanted to switch from Rio to Brasilia. This little square you see around Brasilia, that is the federal district, it was assigned by the emperor. He said, this is where we will maybe kind of someday build a capital. And they chose that place because it's right in the middle of Brazil, and also because an Italian saint called Dom Bosco at one point saw in a dream that the capital of a great empire would exist at those coordinates. As a matter of fact, Dom Bosco is the patron saint of Brasilia. And another good argument for the construction of Brasilia is that if you build a road connecting every place with Brasilia, it serves as this central transportation hub. Now, the arguments against it are that it's a lot farther from the population, right? The main population centers are in São Paulo, they are in Rio. And just like every country in the world, the big population centers are along the coast. Look at all these capitals near the coast, right? So by moving the capital to Brasilia, it was getting a lot farther from the people. It was isolating the political class from mobs that they rule. Essentially, Brasilia is one huge ivory tower. And all of that, those arguments for it, against it, they don't matter nearly as much as how it was implemented. Juscelino wanted to build this thing at all costs, and he wanted it finished on his term. So there was massive spending on it. Building materials were transported via airplanes. There was rampant corruption. Trucks would run around in circles to pretend to deliver the same materials several times over. The construction of Brasilia was so expensive that at one point Juscelino Kubitschek stole the entire country's retirements. I'm not joking. At that time, retirements were managed by workers' unions. So you pay your union, the union saves your money, invests it, pays you back when you retire. Juscelino said he forced all unions to give him all of that saved up money, and in return he pinky swears that the government will look after you when you're old. So he replaced unionized retirement with the public system we know today. And even that wasn't enough. He also plunged the country deep into debt in order to build his ivory tower. So Juscelino Kubitschek is second only to the fascist in how bad he was. And also, he's the reason why we don't have railways. This guy wanted to invest into roads because they create more jobs, which is just another way of saying they're less efficient than, railways. So, yeah, he was crap by every conceivable way. And next we have Jânio Quadros. This guy was a populist. His policies were all over the place. He seems to do whatever he thought would make him the most popular. And this went from regulating which bikinis you can wear at the beach, but also some minor spending cuts. He's the guy who gave a Medal of Honor to Che Guevara. He's the guy who ended import subsidies, which would actually count pretty well for him. But he's also the retard, the absolute dimwit, who decided to invade France. And I'm not even joking. Nobody believes when I say this. He wanted to assimilate, to annex the French Guiana. In the middle of the Cold War, this guy wanted to invade a NATO country for no reason. Because the French Guiana isn't just it's another Guyana, and we informally call it the French Guiana just to tell it apart from the other Guyana. No, it is literally French territory. Brazil has a land border with France, right? France invaded us at one time, and in the, I believe, 70s, we also had the Lobster War, but he wanted to invade France in the middle of the Cold War, a NATO country, with President de Gaulle. This would have been the Brazilian Falklands War. Fortunately, the military didn't like the guy already over a lot of other stuff he had done, so he was forced to renounce before anyone could follow through with his orders. He actually issued orders to invade French Guiana, and he also had plans to invade Uruguay. He essentially said Brazil should span from the Caribbean to the Rio de la Plata because reasons. So clearly an E. The only reason he doesn't have an F is because the military didn't go through with the war. I mean, if a president tries to do something really bad, but gets stopped, I'm not going to count it against him that much, because checks and balances exist for a reason. Right? Just how if a president tries to do something really good and Congress stops him, I'm also not going to count that for him. So, truth be told, I can't give him the F that I want, but oh boy did he try to earn it. And then, he renounced. And when he renounced, he thought that nobody was going to accept his renunciation because his vice president was an utter commie piece of shit. And everybody was really afraid of the commie panic during the Cold War. But no, everybody said, okay, go, get out of here, bye. So, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, as we say. Now, Ranieri Mazzilli, the very first president who is not of Portuguese origin, he's actually of Italian origin, as the name may have implied. He was actually the president of the Chamber of Deputies because when Jânio Quadros was deposed, was forced to resign, his vice president was traveling in China. So Ranieri Mazzilli assumes for 13 days until João Goulart returns from China. And João Goulart assumes he's another horrible president. He's the kind of guy that wants a big state intervention on every sector of the economy. We gotta tax the rich, limit profit transfers from international companies, because, how do you get more investment? You tell people that they'll never see their money again. Beautiful. He wanted the re-legalization of the Communist Party, which I'm actually going to count as a reasonable thing. Communists need representation just like everyone else. But he nationalized oil refinement, electricity, chemicals, and medicine production. He was a guy who hated capitalism. He really was trying to, and even in his foreign policy, that became really evident. He was always visiting the communist countries and never the capitalist countries, or disproportionately far less the capitalist countries, I should say. But what really matters, as far as history is concerned, is that when there were some small sergeant rebellions, and there were two low-ranking military rebellions, he refused to put them down. And this led the higher-ranking military to think that he was planning a coup with the support of these low-ranking soldiers. So things got heated. The military actually proposed a state of exception, which Congress denied, and that pissed the military even more. A few days later, he passed a law out of nowhere that disappropriated massive amounts of land and gave them to the government, which he wanted, or said he wanted, to later distribute that land to the poor. But stealing a ton of land doesn't sit too well with people. So 9 days after that decree, there's a second soldier revolt, which he refuses to punish anyone involved. 6 days after that, troops start marching toward Rio. 1 day after that, he takes his family to the Uruguay border and asks the Uruguayan government for asylum. And 1 day after that, Congress says, if the president won't come to the capital and be the president, then he doesn't get to be the president. So Congress deposed him. So I'm going to put him as a D, because even though his ideology was really bad, there were a lot of checks and balances that stopped him from doing most of the shit he wanted to do. And then Ranieri Mazzilli assumes the presidency again, this time for 9 days, before the military regime properly takes place. Now, some people actually consider Mazzilli the first president of the military regime, but come on, you'd stay there for 9 days. I don't think that's fair to him. I don't know anything about him as a deputy, but as a president, he didn't really do anything. Then we get into the military regime, which goes from 1964 to 1985. And that's going to be all of these guys, all these five. I mean, this was a transition one. I suppose you could count them as seven guys, but whatever. Uh, they were probably pretty good economy wise because in 1964, Brazil was the 49th largest economy in the world. By 1985, when they left, Brazil was the seventh largest economy in the world. That means for every 1 year these guys were in charge, we surpassed the economy of two other countries. That's a really, really big growth. However, there's also an argument that it was a bubble because they did a lot of subsidies, a lot of tariffs, and whenever a company was doing bad, they would buy the company. Government would buy the company in order to keep it running, and that's going to come back to bite us in the ass later. I had a professor in university who said the deindustrialization of Brazil since 1985 is very understandable, but the industrialization up to that point was not understandable, precisely because of all that protectionism, all that subsidy. Because military guys always like big industry and they wanted to turn us away from our agricultural roots, coffee being the majority of the economy, among other things. So, and the last two military guys, Geisel and Figueiredo, those I'm going to give a solid, solid E because they are the guys who started hyperinflation. And hyperinflation is bad. Doesn't take a genius to tell you that. But the first four, there's a reasonable argument that they would get a really good score if we were only thinking of the economy. However, it was a military regime. They limited voting, so we had indirect elections once again. There was a lot of censorship of the media, and they did kill a few people. When I say a few people, estimates vary. The official numbers are around 200, but the wildest estimates go up to 400 people that they killed over 21 years in a country of 100 million people at the time. And there were terrorists in Brazil. There was, I think the largest guerrilla was the Araguaia, which had 80 terrorists and 400 conspirators in the region. They were trying to essentially take over a large plot of land and indoctrinate the populace there. And yeah, and of those 80, 60 were killed. So when you say, oh, the regime killed 200 people, a lot of those were in the Araguaia. Those guys are inflating the numbers. And those were actual terrorists trying to control land, exploit population, etc. And those guys were also killing one another for things like ideological weakness. And that is a quote. So they killed a lot of terrorists. There were some excesses. They killed some journalists who may or may not have been involved with the terrorists, but they did all of that with a reasonable justification because there were bombings. There was a U.S. ambassador who was kidnapped. There were assassinations. There were bank robberies being done by communist terrorists, some of which were trained in Cuba. Some of which actually later on came to regret their crimes and admitted to the kind of stuff that was done at the time, like transferring invasive species to areas to affect crops because they wanted to, I don't know, just bad crops, bad economy, bad looks for the military. But regardless, they did censor the media. They did limit democracy during those years, so I cannot give them the A that they would deserve on an economic scale. So all in all, I'll put them at a B. Except for the last two, which are Geisel and Figueiredo. Those got an E. Now, in 1985, we had the first direct elections since the military took over. And in that election, Tancredo Neves won. But Tancredo Neves doesn't appear here because he died before taking office. And his vice president assumed. Now, by the law, if the president dies before assuming, you should call new elections. But because we were just redemocratizing, people made an exception and Sarney assumed. And we were at a hyperinflation. So Sarney had a brilliant plan for fighting hyperinflation. He said, you can't raise prices because it's illegal. And he just instituted price control. Which, honestly, that should put him at an E. But I will say he didn't cause the problem, he just failed to remedy it. So I'm actually going to give him like a low D or a high E. So somewhere around these parts. And he was followed by Collor, who also had a brilliant plan for fighting hyperinflation. You can't have inflation if you don't have any money. Lol. So Collor froze everyone's savings accounts. And he was, yeah, you can't have inflation if you don't have money. And if that plan succeeded, I would argue that he would deserve a decent spot here somewhere. But no, that doesn't work. You can't just wish away inflation. And he was also extremely corrupt. He appointed his cousin to the Supreme Court, where the guy is to this day. So, corruption gets him a little down. The fact that his plan failed gets him way down. And he even got impeached because he was so bad. So I'm going to put him like here. Really bad, but again, he didn't cause inflation, he just failed to fix it. And he tried very damaging ways to solve it. So I'm actually going to put Collor and Sarney as pretty close to one another. But Collor did have one good thing. His vice president, Itamar Franco. So when Collor was impeached, Itamar Franco assumed. And he's the guy who put an end to the hyperinflation. Now, you could argue that Fernando Henrique ended hyperinflation, but he did it as Itamar Franco's vice president. And so you have to split the laurels between them because they were quite literally working together at the time in order to do it. So I'll put Itamar Franco as the first S-tier president. He stayed for 2.5 years. I have never heard of a major corruption scandal during his presidency, or even a minor one for that matter, and he ended hyperinflation. And by the end of his term, he had between 80% and 90% approval rate. So you'll be hard-pressed to find a Brazilian that dislikes the guy. And then we have Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was a good good president, honestly. Fernando Henrique, when he assumed the country was still like borderline broke, just getting out of super broke and into regular broke. And he started privatizing. Remember how the military guys were buying a bunch of bad companies and keeping them open at a loss? Well, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, he just started privatizing them by the thousands and cutting spending. And he went through a lot of international crises. He went through the Russia crisis, the Japanese crisis, the Mexico crisis, the Argentinian crisis, and I'm probably forgetting another few. And he kept the country cruising through them. He did a genuine, good, solid job. There were a few bits of corruption here and there, but still pretty good. He is also the guy who legalized re-election. So, and ever since he legalized re-elections, every single president has managed to be re-elected. So he got re-elected, Lula got re-elected, Dilma got re-elected, Temer was a vice president, and Bolsonaro is probably going to get re-elected. So Fernando Henrique Cardoso did a good job. And honestly, you could argue for an S tier. But here's the thing. He's ashamed of the good job he did. Because he doesn't talk about it. His party doesn't talk about it. They like to pretend that that never happened because it goes against their ideology. He's the kind of guy who wants a big government spending tons of money, and the only reason he did a good job is because he had no other choice. And nowadays he's ashamed of it, and nowadays he's supporting people who do the exact opposite of what he did. Speaking of, then we have Lula, elected in 2003. And, oh boy, this guy tried to impose media control. He removed a US journalist's visa because he called Lula a drunkard. Everyone who was inconvenient to Lula either went mysteriously missing or had a plane crash. Hell, less than a month ago, there was a leaked audio where he was talking about one of his former allies, saying, called Pelosi, saying, he's been in jail for over a year. Nobody had the competence or the guts to put an end to him. Like, he's literally berating his allies for not killing a guy while he was in jail. He is crap. He's the worst. Actually, no, he's not the worst. Some people manage to be worse. There was a referendum on gun control in 2004, and the people said we don't want more gun control. And he said, heard ya fam, let's do more gun control. He did things that were illegal at the time in order to impose more gun control. And if it was all of that, if it was just that, he would still be fine. I mean, look at this pyramid shape. I mean, ideally, this would be like a bell curve, right? Most presidents being near the middle, and few being really bad, few being really good. But no, this is a pyramid. So it doesn't take much to be pretty high up. But it's not just that. He stole tons of money. He was probably the most corrupt president Brazil has ever had, and we've had a lot of them. He he had this thing called the Mensalão, which was his first major corruption scandal and the largest corruption scandal in Brazilian history up to that day, where he paid millions of reais a month to several legislators in order to control Congress. He bought Congress, and he quite possibly also bought the Supreme Court, although there's no evidence of that, so it's just wild speculation. He spent billions of dollars building infrastructure in other countries, some of which never paid us back. And that was fine. He allowed other countries to nationalize Brazilian state-run companies for a fraction of the price. He sold refineries for like 1% of their price. Refineries were perfectly profitable and had nothing wrong with them. But that might not explain to you the person that is Lula. Lula is a legit kleptomaniac. He steals pens from interviewers. This is something you can see several times where at the end of an interview he swipes a pen away because it's there. Why would he not steal it? Am I right? He, when he left the Palácio da Alvorada, literally the Dawn Palace, Brazil's equivalent of the White House, he left with 3 moving trucks full of furniture, artwork, lots and lots of stuff that isn't his. And all of that was missing for, what, 6, 7 years until some of it was eventually found in a bank vault in his name. So we know it was him. And yet, he's not in jail. Why is he not in jail, despite having been found guilty of corruption on 2 separate courts by a total of 9 judges unanimously? Well, because his lawyer, whom he appointed to the Supreme Court, who just said, I kind of found a reason to say one of those 9 judges is kind of sus, therefore you're free to go. Although nobody, no judge has ever said he was innocent. Not even his lawyer in the Supreme Court, because nobody in a clear conscience can say he is innocent. In fact, Brazil's revenue service is still charging him 18 million reais as income tax over the money he stole. But that's not all. There's one case I really like that I think exemplifies who Lula is. And that's when a can collector is a very poor person who collects aluminum cans at the trash, and sells them at melting value. This very, very poor man found about 8 years' worth of minimum wage in a suitcase and returned it to its owner. And when a reward was offered to him, he said, I don't want money. I just want to meet the president. And because this guy lived in Brasilia, in the capital, that was very easily arranged, and Lula met the man live on TV. And it's crystal clear. Lula, at no point does he congratulate the man. Instead, he's berating him. He's like, why didn't you keep the money? And the guy's like, well, because it isn't mine. I was like, but it could have helped your life so much. And the guy's like, yeah, but that would have been wrong. And Lula is flummoxed. He cannot comprehend, he cannot fathom the idea that honest human beings exist in the world. And if all that wasn't enough, he also provided asylum for far-left terrorists, the most famous of which was Cesare Battisti, an Italian murderer whose lawyer Lula also appointed to the Supreme Court. And his foreign policy was also absolute garbage because he was approximating Brazil with the BRICS. Back when Lula was president, it was BRICS this, BRICS that. Every other week there was a new initiative by BRICS, which is, what is BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later on South Africa. So this guy was trying to get us away from the US, away from Europe, away from our neighbors, and closer to Russia and China. And if that wasn't enough, he also opened like 24 new embassies in teeny tiny countries that nobody heard of, just to appoint his buddies as ambassadors. And if that wasn't enough, he changed the definition of poverty in order to say he ended poverty. And if that wasn't enough, he contracted a new debt at twice the interest rate of our old debt to pay the old debt and just shout to the four winds, I paid our foreign debt. Yes, I am awesome. He also built the Belo Monte Dam, which is about 1/10,000th of the area of the Amazon forest, or the Brazilian Amazon forest. He devastated that area. He forcibly removed the indigenous populations, which the UN claims breaks the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention of the UN, so he should be arrested for it, but that convention requires a Brazilian court to judge him, right? The convention counts as a national law once we rectified it, so he could be arrested for that thing alone. And again, all of that was really bad. But the worst thing he did was that during his government, Brazil went through a commodity boom. That means Brazil's GDP, let's say you produce 2 bananas and you sell them for $10 each. Your GDP is $20. Now let's say the price of banana increases to $15. So now you produce 2 bananas and your GDP is $30. What do you do with the extra 10 that you know is temporary? It's a temporary increase, a big price fluctuation. Do you A, pay your debt? Do you B, invest it in infrastructure or something else? Or do you C, permanently increase your spending in ways that are set in stone and cannot be undone later? Well, Lula chose option C. So he created a ton of new spending with that temporary money. And because spending is written into law, when the price of commodities went back down, and everybody realized, oh shit, Brazil's production didn't actually increase. You didn't start producing 3 bananas, it's just that the banana price went up. And now it went back down. And now we have a spending that is 50%, around 50% higher than what it should have been. And that kind of broke the country, right? All of his massive corruption, all of his massive mismanagement was nothing compared to the huge spending increases that were entirely unfounded. Now, after saying all of that, I have to say at least 2 good things that he did. 3, actually. One is Bolsa Familia. Now, Bolsa Familia was a unification of 3 programs that Fernando Henrique had created, right? So Lula changed the name, unified them into one thing, and made them slightly more efficient by essentially he ended the programs and directly transferred their budget to the people who were affected, which is a far more efficient way of doing things. And this program was pretty huge. It's like 2.5% of the federal budget. So it's a really good government. Yes, it's certainly an improvement of what happened earlier, although a lot of people say that he only really did it to change the name and take credit for something that the previous president did. And even though I despise this guy with every fiber of my being, I have to admit it was still an improvement. The second good thing Lula did was ProUni, which is a program where government pays for private education to people, private universities. So instead of creating a new public university, you can use the same amount of money to create to teach twice as many people. Now, sometimes it's a loan, sometimes they pay 30% of your fee, depends on how poor you are, etc. But it's a very efficient way compared to the alternative, which is public education. And the third thing he did was a retirement reform. Now, remember how a motherfucker just stole everyone's retirement and now the government has to pay it? That is just a bottomless bag of spending, and Lula was forced to cut that spending. And that was such an unpopular measure that it literally split his party in 2 and ended up creating the PSOL, Socialism and Liberty Party, as an offshoot of his party that opposed this unpopular yet necessary reform. But Lula, despite being horrible, that was all his stuff, he made a lot of bubbles. And the thing of bubbles is that you don't become unpopular until they burst. So he actually left the presidency still being very, very popular. So popular, in fact, that he elected his puppet as his scapegoat. Right? His successor, Dilma Roussef, is quite frankly a victim here. And I am genuinely sorry for all women in Brazil's politics, because our first female president was nothing but a glorified scapegoat. Now, she was terrible. She was crap. But she takes the blame for a lot of stuff that she didn't do. She takes the blame for all of the crap that her predecessor did. And because things kind of blew up in her face, and she actually did a lot of crimes, a lot of fiscal crimes mostly, she was impeached. She was impeached a little, fairly early on her second term, and then her vice president assumed. Her vice president being Michel Temer, he could have been just couch potatoes, sit around for 2.5 years doing absolutely nothing, and nobody would have thought any less of him. He could have done a really bad government and blamed it on Dilma just like everybody else. But no. For some reason, which I cannot comprehend, he actually started doing reforms. He started doing the labor reform which allowed for presumption of innocence of employers, who up to that day were considered guilty until proven innocent on most labor cases. He implemented a punishment for false accusations on labor courts. He ended the union taxes, which is essentially, in Brazil, even if you're not a part of the union, you had to pay a tax that the union of your category decided. So if you're an engineer, the engineers union could charge you a tax, and it was as high as they wanted because they're also a monopoly. And yeah, it was crap, and he got rid of a bunch of crap there. And he also started a lot of the big privatizations, which Bolsonaro would later follow through with. So, yeah, President Temer, a surprisingly good president. He and he had no reason, zero incentive to do it. He, as far as I know, he never ran for anything afterward. He didn't even care about his popularity. I don't know if he just did it to spite everyone else, because when Dilma was impeached, he literally he distanced from himself from the case physically. He spent like a few weeks in São Paulo, like, oh no, I'm nowhere near Brasilia, don't talk to me, I have nothing to do with this. So PT, which is Lula and Dilma's party, considered that a treason. So all of their militants, all of the Brazilian far left, started yelling at him and screeching at him and saying he was literally worse than Hitler and shit like that. So he might have done a good government just to spite them. He might have done it because he wanted to be well remembered in history. He might have done it out of the kindness of his heart. He might have done it because, oh, I'm here, might as well. I don't know why he did it, but he did it. And then we reach our current president, Jair Messias Bolsonaro, who privatized 36% of the federally owned companies. The companies he didn't manage to privatize just yet, he changed the administration, so now they yield 100 billion reais more profit a year than they did before. He abolished some 4,000 older laws and about 20,000 regulations from the Ministry of the Economy. He increased gun ownership in Brazil from 300,000 people to 700,000 people. He reduced violent crime by 40% and homicide by around one third. He lowered our debt to GDP ratio. He cut taxes and has just registered the highest revenue ever, meaning he has put the Laffer curve to good use. He has had a budgetary surplus pretty much since the end of COVID, although you can argue when the end of COVID starts, but for the last 4 months in a row, we had a budgetary surplus. We have had 3 months of deflation in a row, and there has never been 2 months of deflation in a row, never mind three. When COVID came, he was against the lockdowns because he said people need to work or they starve. And when the vaccines were invented, he was vaccinating people within 1 month of the vaccines existing. And even then, he never made vaccines mandatory. He was against vaccination passports or anything of the sort. He also made this massive change on how railways are made in Brazil, because previously, the way rails were made is the government decided we need a rail from here to here, and then they auction it off to companies and see who makes it. Now, what happens is a company says, I want a rail from here to here, and I want to build it because I need it or because I want to charge for it for any reason. If I want the railway, can I please build it? And the government only says yes or no based on environmental stuff and yada yada. So now Brazil has like 80 new railways that started being made on the last couple of years. He also reduced our personnel spending to the lowest level since 2008 by just not hiring any or almost any new employees and automating services so they need less people. Literally thousands of services the government provides are now available online, where previously you would have to go to a place and talk to a guy and then go to the bank and pay and go back there, talk to the guy again, get things stamped. So he digitalized a ton of stuff. He also removed the need for permits for low-risk companies like a hairdresser or a seamstress or a shoemaker. Like, nobody's gonna die if your shoemaker is unlicensed, right? Oh my god, my shoe is poorly made, I'm gonna die. No, so there's no need for permits for those things anymore. He also instituted a crime of regulatory abuse for stuff like stifling competition or creating market reserves. And overall, he also made the time it takes to open a company to go down to 2 days, down from 17 at the start of his government. And when I say 2 days, it's over the last few months, it's actually been down to 23 hours, but we haven't seen the yearly average yet, so I can't say it's down to 1 day yet. And of course, he also started deporting terrorists on an international scale. His foreign policies have been to ally with the US, with Europe. Bolsonaro really put forward the deal between UN, sorry, not UN, the European Union and the Mercosur, but France shut that down because gotta protect their own farmers, am I right? While distancing himself from the BRICS and other dictatorships. So Bolsonaro, he has to be an S. Bolsonaro, uh, what can I say bad about him? He's been too neutral on the Ukraine war. Ukraine has asked to buy Brazilian guns, and he refused for absolutely no good reason. So that is crap. I gotta call him out for that. Uh, but other than that, all the accusations people put out against him are like, oh, he said something mean, or entirely made up shit, like the equivalent of an October surprise, like the big news that people put out just before the election, was just, if you put together everyone with the same last name as he has, even people he never met, they bought a number of real estate over the last 30 years, and if you misinterpret enough, you could say some of that was paid in cash, so haha, corruption. But no, what the document said was actually they were paid for in reais, which is essentially saying, yes, he paid with money, with bank transfers, with whatever. And media misinterpreted that to say he bought a bunch of stuff in cash, which is just not true. So, yeah, that is Brazil's presidential tier list. And now, in about, what, 4 days, we will have to decide between Mr. Spending Cuts, Tax Cuts, and Mr. Bubble Maker steals everything not nailed to the ground. So yeah, I think it's a pretty good list. I said a good list should look like a bell curve. It kind of does, except the Coffee and Milk Republic did skew things a little bit because they stayed in power for 32 years. Those bastards. And yeah, that is it, folks. See you.